Hello, this is Steve Matthews speaking, but I'm also sometimes known as the Masked Amp. I was in two minds about making this video since in 2022 the government published a new draft Mental Health Act. This act would abolish the role of the nearest relative and replace it with the nominated person, who can be chosen by the patient and need not be a relative. However, as of November 2023, the government has shown little appetite for putting a new Mental Health Act into law, and it seems unlikely that anything will happen before a general election. The Mental Health Act 1959 first introduced the concept, role and statutory rights and duties of the nearest relative, applying to patients subject to the Act. The 1983 Act and the 2007 Act hardly made any changes. In certain circumstances, the nearest relative under the Mental Health Act can be displaced and replaced with an acting nearest relative. The Code of Practice states an acting nearest relative can be appointed by the county court on the grounds that the nearest relative is incapable of acting as such because of illness or mental disorder, has objected unreasonably to an application for admission for treatment or a guardianship application, has exercised the power to discharge a patient without due regard to the patient's health or well-being or the safety of the public, is otherwise not a suitable person to act as such, or the patient has no nearest relative within the meaning of the Act, or it is not reasonably practicable to ascertain whether the patient has a nearest relative or who that nearest relative is. So, is there any guidance to the practicalities of executing the role of acting nearest relative for professionals? While displacing a patient's nearest relative and appointing an acting nearest relative is not a very common procedure, it happens often enough that all local authorities have detailed written procedures on how AMPs may displace nearest relatives. However, none of them appear to give written guidance on exactly how an individual appointed to take on that role should discharge that duty. Neither the Code of Practice nor the reference guide have anything to say about how someone appointed to act as a nearest relative should act. The Mental Health Act itself makes the only reference to specific duties in section 116. This states, where a patient to whom this action applies is admitted to a hospital, the authority shall arrange for visits to be made to him on behalf of the authority and shall take such other steps in relation to a patient while in the hospital as would be expected to be taken by his parents. Section 1162 defines to whom this section applies. It predominantly applies to children and young people, but it also includes a person the functions of whose nearest relative under this Act are for the time being transferred to a local social services authority. Richard Jones in the Mental Health Act manual has little to add to the bare words of the Mental Health Act. However, David Hewitt, the author of the Nearest Relative Handbook, says that the acting nearest relative must be treated as if they were the substantive nearest relative. He interprets this to mean that they should exercise all the nearest relative rights, interestingly including the right to delegate nearest relative status. He points out that to act as a patient's representative is not the identified role of the nearest relative. This means that the local authority appointed acting nearest relative is a distinct role from that of the independent mental health advocate, IMHA. He acknowledges that the role of the acting nearest relative is ill-defined, but points out that this is also the case for a normal nearest relative. The nearest relative has some wide-ranging powers and duties. These include the right to be consulted regarding decisions being made by professionals concerning the patient, the right to make an application in their own right under sections 2, 3, 4 or 7, and the right to request that an AMP assess the patient under section 13.4 of the Mental Health Act. If the acting nearest relative is an AMP employed by either the local authority or the local mental health trust, it is actually quite difficult to see how they might comfortably exercise some of these powers and functions. Indeed, David Hewitt points out that there is considerable scope for conflicts to arise with the role of the AMP, the role of the IMHA, the wider advocacy role, and with the role of the Director of Social Services. He has suggested that possible solutions to these conflicts could be by neighbouring local authorities having reciprocal arrangements to provide this role, or even to use some sort of external independent provider. If you have been, thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or informative, please don't forget to like and follow.